He began searching for a tool to use in eliminating his boss, and he found a crowbar in the kitchen. Hello, friends. How are you today? I hope you're all healthy and successful. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends. This story is based on true events, compiled from news that has already circulated and been published by several media outlets, which we've presented in a narrative format. Let's begin the story. Daparam Nainggolan and his wife Maya, who come from Samosir Regency, North Sumatra, were married in 2008 and were blessed with 2 children. In 2012, they decided to move to Jakarta. There, they lived in Bojong Gede, Bogor Regency. In Jakarta, Daparam initially worked as a Transjakarta bus driver, while his wife worked as an admin at a private company. Their decision to move to Jakarta was also influenced by Daparam's older brother, Douglas Nainggolan, who had already moved to Jakarta. In fact, Douglas had become quite successful there. At that time, Douglas owned a rental business with 28 units in the Bojong Nangka 2 area, which is part of Pondok Melati, Bekasi. He also had a small grocery store in front of the gate of his rental units. Douglas, who was still single, lived in one of the units he owned. He also had 3 cars, a Honda CR-V for daily use, a Nissan X-Trail as a second car, and a box truck for his grocery store. He managed both his rentals and the grocery store on his own. However, because his work often required him to travel out of town for weeks or even months, he hired a friend named Jito to manage the rentals and the grocery store for him. Jito, overwhelmed by managing everything on his own, secretly invited his friend Harris to help, especially with running the grocery store. However, once Harris started managing the store, problems arose, such as disorganized financial records and poor management. A store that used to be busy with customers became quiet due to Harris's poor service. The store would sometimes be open, sometimes closed, and it seemed Harris wasn't dedicated to the job. After discovering the financial issues at his store, Douglas became frustrated and fired Jito, believing that Jito was responsible for all the problems. Douglas was unaware that Jito had recruited Harris to help run the store. Finally, in 2016, Douglas offered his younger brother, Daparam, to take over managing the rentals and the grocery store, replacing Jito. Daparam, who had previously worked as a Transjakarta bus driver, accepted the offer. He moved into the house behind the shop, which was intended for the person managing both the shop and the rental properties. Douglas also entrusted Daparam with the use of the Nissan X-Trail for his daily needs, as well as the box truck for shopping for supplies for the grocery store. Since then, Daparam, his wife, and their 2 children lived in that house. Under Daparam's management, the store gradually improved, becoming cleaner, and the opening and closing hours became more consistent. Not only that, the number of customers increased as many felt comfortable with Daparam's friendly and polite service. The financial records for both the store and the rentals became much more organized and transparent. In the beginning, everything ran smoothly, even successfully, with no issues in the store or the rental business. However, a few years later, in 2018, trouble began when Harris, who had been responsible for the store's previous decline, returned. At that time, he was struggling because he was unemployed and having difficulty paying for his rented room. Harris was originally from Pekanbaru, and after applying for various jobs without success, he came back to the store because he knew Daparam. Harris asked Daparam for help, requesting to be allowed to work at the store again, and also asked for permission to stay temporarily behind the store until he found a job. Out of pity, Daparam, unaware that Harris had been the cause of the store's previous problems, allowed him to stay behind the shop and help out. However, once Harris started working again, his bad habits returned. He seemed uninterested in the work, which caused Daparam, who had never been angry before, to often scold him. Daparam's frustration was not without reason. He gave Harris advice for his own good, but Harris, being easily offended, became upset every time he was reprimanded. This marked the beginning of the horrific events at that place. After a month of staying behind the store, Harris decided to move and rent a room nearby. Even though he had moved out, Harris continued working at the store because he hadn't yet found another job. However, since moving, Harris often arrived late to work, which again irritated DePerham. The peak of the issue occurred on Tuesday morning, November 13th, 2018. At that time, DePerham angrily called Harris because Harris, who was supposed to start work, had not shown up. DePerham had been waiting all day, but by evening, Harris still hadn't arrived. It wasn't until around 9 p.m. that Harris finally came to the store, which made DePerham very angry. Despite his frustration, DePerham still instructed Harris to help with the financial records and close the store. After closing the store, Harris, whose rented room was far away, asked for permission to spend the night at DePerham's house behind the store. Initially, DePerham refused, fearing that Douglas might find out. But feeling sorry for Harris, and since it was already late and Douglas was out of town for work, DePerham allowed Harris to stay the night, but only in the kitchen. Secretly, Harris felt offended for being told to sleep in the kitchen. It was there, while in the kitchen, that his evil intent arose to Elminette DePerham and his family that very night. His pent-up resentment made his decision firm. He began searching for a tool to strike DePerham and found a crowbar in the kitchen. Once he ensured that everyone was fast asleep, Harris quietly entered DePerham's bedroom, where DePerham and his wife were soundly sleeping. There, Harris repeatedly struck their heads with the crowbar, hitting them over and over until they no longer moved and had taken their last breaths. The sound of the blows had been quite loud, which caused the two children, who were sleeping in another room, to wake up. Harris quickly approached them and tried to calm them down when they asked, "What was that noise?" Harris simply told them that their parents were sick and instructed the children to go back to sleep and stay quiet. After the children went back to sleep, Harris became confused because they had seen him. He feared that they might eventually tell someone, which would lead to suspicion falling on him. Thus, he decided to eliminate the children as well. Harris hardened his resolve and coaled both children by strangling them at the same time until they no longer moved. Afterward, Harris searched through DePerham's bedroom. He took the keys to the Nissan X-Trail, several million rupiah in cash from the wardrobe, and 2 mobile phones belonging to DePerham and his wife. After finishing, at around 2 a.m., Harris fled in the parked Nissan X-Trail from the rental property. Harris drove back to his rented room. On the way, he stopped at the Kalimalang River Bridge to throw the crowbar into the river, discarding it as evidence. After that, he returned to his rented room to rest. The next day, after securing the money, Harris invited a few of his hiking friends to climb Mount Guntur in Garut, West Java, with the intention of calming his nerves after what he had done. On that Wednesday, Harris went hiking, leaving the Nissan X-Trail at his rented room. His friends had no idea what Harris had done. They hiked peacefully, while, on the other hand, a few hours after the incident, one of DePerham's tenants went to the shop to buy some drinking water, but the shop was still closed, even though it should have been open by that time. At first, the tenant thought that DePerham and his family were still sleeping. However, after looking more closely, they noticed something strange. The gate next to the shop, which led to DePerham's house, was wide open. Because the gate was open, they tried to check and called out for DePerham to buy water, but there was no response. The tenant could hear the sound of the TV coming from inside the house, but since no one answered, they returned to their rented unit, waiting for the shop to open. A few hours later, as the sun was high in the sky, the same tenant returned to the shop, but it was still closed, and the gate remained wide open. Since it was unusual for the shop to remain closed at that hour and the house appeared lifeless, the tenant became worried. Even the sound of DePerham's children could not be heard. Growing more suspicious, the tenant decided to enter again through the open gate, heading toward DePerham's house. When they peeked through the bedroom window, they were shocked to see DePerham and his wife motionless, their heads covered in blood. Terrified, the tenant immediately ran back to the rental units and reported what they had seen to the other residents. Together, they alerted the local community and the neighborhood head. Upon further inspection, everyone was horrified and immediately reported the incident to the police. By midday, the area was crowded with residents and police officers who began investigating the case. The police promptly contacted Douglas to inform him of the situation. Douglas, who was working out of town at the time, was shocked, as DePerham was his younger brother. He immediately made arrangements to return home. The police continued to investigate what had happened. Initially, everyone suspected it was a robbery because Deperam's car was missing. The night before, local residents who had been on patrol had seen Deperam's car speeding down the alley. They testified that the car had likely been driven away by the robber. However, something strange stood out. If it had been a robbery, Deperam's guard dog should have barked, yet no one had heard the dog bark that night. This led the police to suspect that the perpetrator might be someone close to the family. They began tracking down Deperam's car. The next day, the police received information about the car's location. They immediately went to the scene and found the vehicle parked at a boarding house in Kampung Pasir Limas, North Cikarang, the same boarding house where Harris lived. When the car was found, it was empty, but there were red stains on the driver's door handle that the perpetrator had not yet cleaned. This finding further confirmed to the police that the car had indeed been taken by the suspect. The police then questioned the other residents of the boarding house about who owned or had brought the car. Those who had seen Harris with the car pointed the police to Harris's room. The police requested permission from the landlord to search the room, as Harris was still out hiking at the time. Once permission was granted, the police searched Harris's room. Inside, they found 2 mobile phones belonging to Deperam and his wife, the car keys, and a pair of black pants covered in dried stains. These discoveries were more than enough to serve as strong evidence. Shortly after that, the police received information that Harris was hiking on Mount Guntur in Garut, West Java. The police immediately went there to arrest him. That night, exactly at 10 p.m., the police managed to apprehend Harris while he was resting in a hut at the foot of the mountain, sitting with his fellow hikers. He was immediately taken into custody and brought in for further questioning. The next day, the news shocked many people, as it turned out that the perpetrator was Harris, who had been helped by Deperam all this time. During interrogation, Harris had no choice but to confess, as the evidence found in his boarding room was more than enough to prove that he was the culprit. Harris then admitted and detailed everything he did that night. In the end, during the trial, Harris, who had heartlessly murdered Deperam, his wife, and their 2 young children, was sentenced to death, as there was no mitigating factor for his crime. Meanwhile, the Deperam, his wife, and their 2 children were returned to North Sumatra and buried in Deperam's hometown in Samosir Regency. After the case was closed, a letter was found in Deperam's child's room. It was a handwritten message by the child before the incident, almost as if it was their last words. The letter read, "Mom, Dad, please forgive me. I've made you angry. I promise I won't be disobedient anymore. I will listen to you. I will pray diligently, worship, read the Bible, and I won't be afraid of demons anymore. I will fear God, Jesus Christ. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for taking care of me since I was a baby, a toddler, and a child. Mom, you've worked hard cooking for me, and Dad, you've worked for me. Thank you, Mom and Dad." It's true, sometimes there are signs before someone passes away, and they are often realized only after the person is gone. What are your thoughts on this case, and what lessons can we learn from it? Write your answers in the comments, subscribe, and see you in the next Casa.